Generally, clinical trials are designed to help us improve care to patients, whether it's adding an additional medication or other treatment to a standard of care already. The goal is that we're going to find better ways to treat cancer and cure it. The only way we can do that is through clinical research.
So when I talk to patients about clinical trials, I really bring out two reasons why I think they should consider being on a clinical trial. The first is because it can certainly help them, and of course that's the most important reason. The reason we do these clinical trials is because we know that we have to do better. We have to do better in treating cancer, and this is the way where we can take all the knowledge that we've learned over the past decades about how cancer grows, how to treat it, and really apply that to our patients. This is the best way that we can do that. What I always tell patients is that when we do a clinical trial, it's because we have a scientific reason to believe that the treatments are going to be helpful. It doesn't always work out that way, and that's why it's a trial. We have to do these trials to prove whether or not indeed we have a new and better treatment for a particular kind of cancer. The second reason that I oftentimes ask folks to consider going on a trial is it can help folks like them down the line. And what do I mean by that? All the standard cancer treatments that we have in our arsenal right now are only there, and we only know how to use them because people who have come before have been willing to say, I'm willing to embrace some of the uncertainty that comes along with being on a clinical trial and to participate in this. And that's how we've learned and how we've advanced the field. So to kind of put those two together, what I tell my patients is I can't guarantee that going on a clinical trial is going to help you. I have reason to think it might, based on the science behind it, and we've certainly helped many, many patients with clinical trials. But I can promise that it's going to help folks like you. It's going to help us down the road so that in 5 years, I can sit down with a patient and I can say, because those patients 5 years ago were willing to go on a clinical trial, we know that drug X or treatment Y is good and works, or it doesn't. And that's not the reason why someone should go on a trial. It should really be about them. But I think for a lot of patients who are suffering from cancer and going through that struggle, it's very meaningful to be able to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And knowing that going on a clinical trial may help them, certainly, but will also help advance the field and also help folks walking the same path that they're walking down the road, it's very powerful. And I think that speaks to a lot of people. So I don't think it's just one reason, but I think there are multiple reasons why, in the right situation, a clinical trial is a great idea for someone who's going through cancer treatment.
I was diagnosed with Clark's 4 melanoma, and they asked me if I was willing to be in a clinical study, and I was chosen for the interferon dosage. And I did that for Monday through Friday for the whole month of July, and then after that I gave myself a shot 3 times a week for a year, and then for 10 years I had to report in and see how I was doing, and everything turned out great.
I wouldn't really consider patients on clinical trials guinea pigs. Most patients on clinical trials are going to get the standard of care treatment plus an additional medication or drug that might improve their outcome. So we're really not taking something that's never been proven to work in the past and seeing if it'll work. Most of the clinical trials, the drugs have been tested in the lab and other situations before they're brought to human trials. So I really wouldn't consider patients a guinea pig.
When I get asked by patients if they're going to be a guinea pig, I tell them no. When I think of a guinea pig, it's a lab animal that has no say in whether or not they participate in the trial, locked in a cage with no rights to say that they don't want treatment anymore. On the flip side, our patients are certainly informed about why they think a treatment may be beneficial for them. They have the right to ask questions, to participate actively in their care, and they have the right to say that they don't want to be on this trial anymore. They want to stop the trial treatment. I think that's what really separates the two. In the sense of, are there things that can come up during trials that are unknown? Yeah, these are experimental trials. And so I think that aspect of things is a part of the trial process. But I consider our trials with their informed consent with the team approach and the provider and the patient working together, much different than being a lab animal. So I would not call patients going through trials any kind of guinea pig.
I still had my same level of care. They were very, I don't know, this almost bend over backwards to ask me, take care of me, see how I was doing, you know, they'd call. So no, I didn't feel like a guinea pig.
Generally, your care will be the same whether you're on a clinical trial or not. If there's periodic blood work that needs to be done, that'll all be done, imaging. The care that you get should be equivalent and perhaps superior than the care that you would get off of a clinical trial.
When we have patients on clinical trials, I personally believe that their care is actually better. And the reason for that is because we have such a kind of regimented schedule of how often we see the patient, what labs need to be drawn, what we do with the medication if certain side effects may come up, that they're getting followed more closely. Their safety net is even better than the safety net that we have for patients who are off a clinical trial, which I think is actually quite good. In terms of how your actual care day to day may change, it varies from trial to trial. Certainly there are some trials where your time commitment will be greater, where you'll have to come in for more visits, perhaps have more blood draws, perhaps have more scans, et cetera. But we're cognizant of that, and we want to make sure that those extras aren't too burdensome, that they don't detract from a patient's quality of life. So if anything, I would say that baseline level of care is going to be there. It's going to be solid. Being on a clinical trial, I think, raises the bar and actually makes sure that we're keeping even a closer eye on those patients.
That's a difficult question to answer. Some medications may make you feel sicker. Some medications may have better side effects than the drugs that we currently use. So that's a hard question to answer. The answer is yes and no.
We often get asked whether trial treatments, trial drugs are going to be harder on a patient than their standard treatments. And the answer is very simply, we often don't know. Certainly, when you're investigating a new treatment or a different treatment option, there's a chance that that treatment may be more difficult than the standard treatment. There's also a chance it may be easier. In fact, there are clinical trials out there that are specifically tailored to answer the question, which treatment is better tolerated? Which treatment is easier? I think the comforting thing for me, putting patients on a clinical trial, is that the guidelines and the criteria that guide us in terms of how to treat a patient on the trial are very clear in terms of here's the side effects you need to watch out for with this particular drug, here's the steps that you should take to combat those side effects. And also, here's the changes you can make to the treatment to try to make those side effects easier. So what I would tell a patient is that certainly there may be more side effects from a clinical trial treatment, but we have very strict criteria in place how to deal with those. And then, of course, at the end of the day, as a patient, you're in charge. If you decide the side effects from this trial treatment or any treatment are too difficult, we can stop it. And so I think for the most part, folks who are on clinical trials do very similarly in terms of their side effects to those who aren't. And in fact, we watch them a little bit more closely. So we can maybe, treat early side effects as opposed to waiting until they get more severe. And so I really encourage patients not to let that concern get in the way of them going on a clinical trial.
I was sick the very first time that I got the interferon, and after that I just felt tired. Had the chills for that first month that I had to go every day. And then after that, I was okay.
Most of the time, if your doctor is offering you a clinical trial, they're the ones that are participating in the clinical trial, and your care would stay with them.
In terms of clinical trial enrollment, typically the rules regarding travel or physicians that you see is that once you start a clinical trial at a certain institution or with a certain physician, you stay with that institution or that physician. There are certainly some centers that will have, one physician seeing all the patients on X clinical trial, a second physician on Y. That's not typically how we do it. And the way that we do it here is, if I'm caring for a patient who in the midst of their care is eligible for a clinical trial, I'm the doctor who enrolls that patient on the trial. I'm the doctor who follows them through that trial. I'm the doctor who works with all the side effects on that trial and then decides when it's time potentially to come off the trial. We think that continuity of care is very important. Certainly in the midst of that, you're going to see other people. We as a cancer center work in a large group, so you would see other members of the group. But I think for most of our patients at least, they don't have to change doctors. They can stay with the doctor they're comfortable with, who can then guide them through why that clinical trial might be right for them and can guide them through the treatment on that trial. I think most patients prefer that and find that comforting.
Generally, there aren't extra costs for the patients for the clinical trial. There may be extra costs to the institution that's running the trial, but generally no extra cost to the patient.
The issue of cost is a big one. As our cancer drugs get more and more expensive, the costs of cancer care go up. The way that it typically works, and I say typically because every trial is just a little bit different, is as follows. If there is a treatment as a part of the trial that is considered standard of care, meaning this is the exact same treatment that I would give you off a trial, it's been approved, that is typically paid for by your insurance. Okay? Scans, blood work, any other tests that would be a part of the standard of care that we would do even if you were not on a trial, that's also paid for by insurance. Okay? Anything extra? Any extra, the new part of the treatment that's maybe not approved, that's usually not paid for by insurance, but paid for by the trial. Any extra blood work, scans, et cetera, same rules apply. So what I tell patients is that typically there should be no extra cost to them. And I think that's very important to hear, that the standard of care is paid for by insurance. The extras that the trial may bring are usually covered by the trial, so they don't have to sacrifice financially to be a part of the trial.
There may be some additional time commitments to participating in a clinical trial. Some clinical trials require more intensive lab work to be done periodically than would normally be done, or additional imaging which the patient might have to go through that may not normally be done to follow how you're responding to the treatment. So there may be some extra time commitments.
There certainly can be extra time commitments. For the majority of our trials, I would say those are minimal. For some trials where we're really looking at how the body handles or processes a certain drug, there can be more frequent blood draws, for instance, where you have to perhaps even be in the hospital for frequent blood draws or come back once a week for very intensive testing. I would say that is a minority of the trials that are out there, but I think it's a very important question to ask because as physicians, one of our goals is really to try to maintain quality of life. And if by going on a trial we're hindering that, especially if there's someone who has to travel for 200 miles just for every blood draw or for every scan, we would think twice about that. And we have to make sure that those considerations are also thought of when we're trying to decide whether to put a patient on a trial or not.
After that first month of steady there, like I say, giving my shots, can't remember quite how often I had to go to check in, but nothing out of the ordinary, I would say, no.
For most clinical trials, your treatment would be where your doctor is at. It'd be unusual for you to have to travel out of state for a clinical trial unless there's a trial that's not open or available where you're living and is only available at a certain center.
When you think about clinical trials, there are clinical trials open all over the country, all over the world, in fact. I have had patients who travel overseas for a clinical trial. I have certainly had patients who travel out of state for a clinical trial, but the majority of my patients that we treat on clinical trial, it's done right here at home. And I think that's something that we're really trying to improve here, is to say, how can we bring these new medications, these exciting new treatments close to home so people don't have to travel? Because we recognize, as I said earlier, this is not just about treating cancer, it's about treating the whole patient. And for them to be able to get that care close to home is going to improve their quality of life. That being said, there's certainly, not every cancer center can have every clinical trial open. There are literally thousands of them out there right now. And so there are times when if you have a patient with a particular disease at a particular stage and you feel they're right for a clinical trial, you may recommend that they travel out of state to a different cancer center where they have access to a clinical trial that we don't here. That's often a difficult choice for that patient to make. And as an oncologist, we help them work through that and really ask the question, how exciting is this treatment? If this is really an exciting treatment that we think can provide real benefit, oftentimes folks will travel even across the country for that. So that's not an easy question to answer because it really depends on what the trial is and where they're getting their oncology care at. But certainly it is something to raise with a patient's provider in that if an oncologist tells a patient, well, we don't have any clinical trials here for you right now, but they're interested, then they can ask, are there trials elsewhere that I might be a candidate for? And then I think that oncologist can work with the interested patient to try to determine whether there are trials elsewhere that may be of benefit.
I went from where we lived to Sioux Falls. It was an hour each way, which I guess in this day and age I don't consider that a great distance, but at the time, when I had to go 5 days a week for a month, it got to be kind of a lot, but after that it was fine.
Hospitalization during cancer treatment is variable, and it really depends on what treatment you're getting and whether you have any side effects or problems that can occur whether or not you're on a clinical trial.
Most patients who go on a clinical trial never need to be hospitalized. Most of the clinical trial treatments that we have are outpatient treatments that can be given either in pill form or through an IV. They do require frequent follow-up as an outpatient with an oncologist and frequent treatment visits. There certainly are some clinical trials that, because of the nature of the chemotherapy and the close monitoring that has to be done, they do require inpatient admission. Once again, that's a question to ask your provider as you're talking about a clinical trial. And then, of course, there's always the risk that the trial treatment itself could lead to complications that require hospital admission. So I think there's certainly a chance that patients on clinical trials would end up in the hospital. But for the majority of patients who go on trials, the actual planned treatment does not require hospitalization. It can be done as an outpatient.
Just was at home and never just went to Sioux Falls for the treatment, and that was it. That was all.
Once you sign up for a clinical trial, it is 100% your choice as to whether or not you want to continue to participate in the trial. And if at any point in time you change your mind, you're free to withdraw from the trial.
When you enter the clinical trial process, there is a lot of paperwork that has to be done, and one of those pieces of paperwork is the consent form. And basically, this walks through why we think this treatment makes sense, the details of the treatment, how it's given, how often it's given, walks through the side effects of the treatment in some detail to make sure that the patient is truly informed as to what we're getting them into. When you sign that consent form, you're essentially saying that today I consent to participate in this trial, with the key word there being today. That consent can be withdrawn at any point. It can be withdrawn the day after you sign it. When we talk about trials, we often talk about how long we expect treatment to be. It's going to be so many weeks or so many months. And after that, we have follow-up of so many weeks or so many months. Once again, that's the planned follow-up. If as a patient, for whatever reason, you feel the trial is not right for you at that time, it is within your rights, and in fact you should withdraw from the trial. And there's no prejudice held against those patients. We certainly walk through the issues that have led them to want to withdraw from the trial and see if we can address those. But if not, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and then we would move forward and continue to try and treat that patient as best we can off a trial. So it doesn't lock you in any way, shape, or form.
They were upfront, I guess I'll say about that. They just do whatever, and if you feel like you don't want to do it, you can quit.
I believe that most of the time when the study is ended, most researchers will do what we call unblinding the study. So the investigator and the patient will be able to find out if they got the investigational drug or a drug that we consider a placebo. It depends on the study.
When we talk about cancer trials, one of the questions that often comes up is, what if I get a placebo? which is in very simple terms, a sugar pill. It's not always that simple, but that's one way to think about it. The first point I would make there is that our use of placebos in the world of clinical trials has gone down dramatically over the past number of years. And that's because our patients know we're making a lot of progress. And many of them are not okay with getting a sugar pill, and we're not okay with that either, to be honest. And so if that is a concern, there certainly are trials that still use placebos. But typically how they work is that there's more patients getting the active drug than a placebo. Or if you get a placebo, once we prove that that placebo is not working, you can get the real drug. And so the way that we've set these trials up recently, I think, gives our patients more confidence that whenever possible they are going to get the active drug, which is what they want. The other question that often comes up is, well, will we know if I get the placebo or the actual drug? And that varies from trial to trial. What I would say is, for the most part, once you're done with the treatment, at some point we can obtain that information to determine whether you were on the active drug or the placebo. In some cases, they want us to wait for a while to get more results before they unblind that, as we put it. But I would also say that if it is an important part of medical decision making, if someone gets very ill during a clinical trial, and we as the doctors and the patients have to know whether they're getting drug or placebo to help guide how we manage that patient, that we can find that out. So that's not in a box locked away forever. If we absolutely need that information, we can get it.
Most of the time, patients aren't asked to participate in a clinical trial because there are no other options for them. There are situations when you've failed all our traditional treatments, and some experimental drugs which haven't been proven are used in clinical trials, but most of the time that's not the case.
So as I mentioned earlier, there are all different kinds of clinical trials. There are certainly some in exactly that setting where we've worked through and used all the treatments that are known to be effective, and then we start asking the question, well, what else is new? What else is out there that may work? And in that setting, those are drugs that are largely going to be unproven. There's a scientific basis to believe that they may be effective, but they've never been proven in patients. That's certainly one group of trials that we run. I think the majority of patients, however, who go on clinical trials are not in that setting. Those kind of clinical trials really ask the question, okay, we have a treatment A that we know works, but it doesn't work as well as we'd like. How can we improve it? How can we make that treatment better? And so in a trial like that, for instance, half the patients go on that standard treatment. We know that's good treatment. We know that that treatment provides benefit for most patients. The other half of those folks may go on a different treatment or the same treatment plus a new drug to say, how can we improve this? Okay? And so there, certainly, it's not a question of we don't have any options left. We have a lot of options, in fact. It's which is the best. And I think those are probably the best trials, because that really helps us advance the field to figure out how do we make good better so we can move the field forward.
I personally would consider a clinical trial if I was diagnosed with a cancer or if I had a family member that was diagnosed. It's really one way that the patient can give back to the medical community and other patients that are in their shoes to help us develop better treatments for cancer.
What I often say is that it's an impossible question to answer. And the reason I say that is because you are going to have different values and backgrounds and goals than I might, or that the person down the street might. Okay? I think it's very important that we're not a cookie cutter practice and say everyone who has X diagnosis has to go on X trial. No, we have to make sure that every patient's individual goals, their values, their needs are taken into account. So I think that's how I answer the question. But our kind of national guidelines say that the best treatment for a patient is usually a clinical trial, and I agree with that. I think it's very, very rare for me to say to a patient, here's a clinical trial, but for X, Y, or Z reason, I don't think that's right for you. I certainly do it, but for most patients, it's absolutely worth considering for all the reasons we've talked about already. It provides you, potentially new medications that you can't get anywhere else that can be of benefit. It provides you that kind of safety net where we have a lot of folks watching very closely to make sure that you tolerate the treatment well, and you're helping to advance the science, which, as I said, I think many people find very meaningful. And so for all those reasons, I think if it was my family member, I would say absolutely. If there's a trial, you should consider it. It might not be right, but at least consider it.
I think you need to really be open to it, discuss it with your family, with your doctor, and what do you have to lose? You know, it's something that might help more people in the future receive more treatment that helps you. We all get the baseline care, but that might help us to get a step up in more options, I guess.